Good morning. Please, I'm Janet Sintim Abuaji, a lecturer at Christian Service University College. I'm here to discuss a topic: ovulation and menstrual cycle. What is ovulation? Ovulation is the release of an egg or ovum. It is the process whereby the matured Graafian follicle releases the ovum and the surrounding fluid, liquor folliculi, into the peritoneum about 14 days prior to the next menstrual period, and it occurs once in every month from puberty to the menopause. Hypothalamus will act on the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland will also release follicle-stimulating hormone to act on the ovary to become matured, ripe, and then rupture. The cells that are left behind becomes filled with a yellow substance known as luteum. That is, after the rupturing of the ovary, the ovum will be released, and the empty space is known as the luteum. The whole cavity forms a mass known as corpus luteum. The corpus luteum continues to grow until the 3rd month of pregnancy, when its function is taken over by the placenta. The function of the corpus luteum is to produce estrogen and progesterone to sustain the pregnancy. That is, the corpus luteum, when it is being produced, it will act on the fallopian tube and the uterus to make it tortuous, spongy, and compact. If pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum degenerates about the 24th day of menstrual cycle. What is left behind is known as corpus albicans. The ovulation process is defined by a period of elevated hormones during the menstrual cycle. It can be divided into 3 phases: the peri-ovulatory or follicular phase, the ovulatory phase, the post-ovulatory or luteal phase. The peri-ovulatory or follicular phase. A layer of cells around the ovum begins to emulsify or become more like mucus and expand. The uterus lining begins to thicken. The ovulatory phase. Enzymes are secreted and form a hole or stigma. The ovum and its network of cells use the stigma to move into the fallopian tube. That is, after the ovum is being released, there's a stigma which helps to move the cells through the fallopian tube before it reaches the uterus. This is the period of fertility and usually lasts from 24 to 48 hours. That is, the ovum is supposed to be alive between 24 to 48 hours. After 48 hours, if no fertilization occurs, the ovum will die. The post-ovulatory or luteal phase. Luteinizing hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland, after releasing the luteinizing hormone to act on the corpus luteum, the luteinizing hormone, after it has been released by the anterior pituitary gland, it will act on the empty space so that progesterone will be produced. A fertilized egg will be implanted into the womb, while an unfertilized egg slowly stops producing hormones and dissolves within 24 hours. Luteinizing hormone, after it has been produced by the anterior pituitary hormone will act on the corpus luteum. A fertilized egg will be implanted into the womb, while an unfertilized egg slowly stops producing hormones and dissolves within 24 hours. The lining of the uterus also begins to break down and prepares to exit the body during menstruation or menses. Menstruation. This is the physiological bleeding and shedding of the endometrium, including unfertilized ovum, which begins approximately 14 days after ovulation. That is, if no fertilization occurs, the endometrium will shed off, including the capsular layer and the spongy layer. And then the unfertilized ovum will also be added to be expelled as menstruation. The duration of the menstrual flow is about 3 to 5 days, but we can have extremes about 1 to 8 days. The average blood loss is about 60 to 70 mL, but there can be great variations in the blood loss. Menstruation is controlled by hormones from the anterior pituitary gland and also the ovarian hormone. Indirectly, the anterior pituitary gland influences menstruation, and then directly by the ovarian hormone. The anterior pituitary gland produces follicle-stimulating hormone, which influences the maturation of the Graafian follicle, and the Graafian follicle produces estrogen. And this is by the help of the theca cells, the external theca and the internal theca, which is within the Graafian follicle. That is, when the Graafian follicle is matured, it will compare the theca, external and internal, to produce estrogen. The anterior pituitary gland produces luteinizing hormone, which helps in the development of the corpus luteum, which also produces progesterone. To help with the development of the fallopian tube and the uterus, that is, when the progesterone is also produced, it will prepare the fallopian tube and the uterus so that the fetus can also get nutrients and oxygen for development. Menstrual cycle. What is menstrual cycle? My objective is, at the end of the lesson, students will be able to define menstrual cycle, list the phases of the menstrual cycle, explain the phases of the menstrual cycle, and describe the menarche. Menstrual cycle is a series of events occurring regularly every month in the female from puberty to the menopause. These events are controlled by the pituitary gland and bring some changes in the uterus. The phases of the menstrual cycle. What are the phases of the menstrual cycle? The regenerating phase, the regenerative phase, proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and the menstrual cycle. In some books, they use 3 phases, which is proliferative phase, the secretory phase, and menstrual cycle or menstrual phase, whilst others also use 4 phases. The phases of the menstrual cycle. The regenerative phase. This takes about 2 to 3 days soon after menstruation, and during this time, the endometrium is being reformed. It's like the endometrium is being cleared. Proliferative phase. This lasts about 10 days after menstruation. During this phase, the follicle-stimulating hormone influence Graafian follicle to become matured. And estrogen is produced during the process of maturation by the theca cells, that is theca externa and theca interna, to prepare the uterus and fallopian tube. And estrogen is produced during the process of maturation by the externa and interna theca cells. And the estrogen will prepare the uterus and fallopian tube. The cells of the endometrium grow in size and in thickness. The secretory phase. This extends from the day of ovulation to the next menstrual flow. After ovulation, large amounts of progesterone are produced by the corpus luteum under the influence of the luteinizing hormone by the anterior pituitary gland. The progesterone causes the endometrium to become more vascular and spongy in readiness for a fertilized ovum. In a fully matured secretory endometrium, 3 layers are formed called the compact, spongy, and basal layers. Compact layer. The glands are highly packed together. The intermediate or the spongy layer. In this layer, the glands are more widened and tortuous. The last layer is the basal layer or inactive layer. This is the layer close to the myometrium, and it is the last layer within. The endometrium during the secretory phase is richly supplied with blood and lymphatics in readiness to receive and to nourish a fertilized ovum. In readiness to receive and to nourish a fertilized ovum. If no fertilization takes place, there is degeneration of the endometrium. The menstrual phase. This is the shedding of the superficial 2/3 of the endometrium, which is the spongy and the compact layers. The beginning of the menstrual phase indicates the end of the cycle. The menstrual phase lasts for about 3 to 5 days and occurs about every 28 days from puberty to menopause. Just before menstruation begins, the corpus luteum begins to regress and estrogen and progesterone secretion decline, and ischemia develops in the endometrium, followed by separation of the first 2 layers occur, leading to bleeding or menstruation. The endometrium follows just before menstruation begins. The corpus luteum begins to regress, and estrogen and progesterone secretion decline, and ischemia develops in the endometrium, followed by separation of the first 2 layers occur, leading to bleeding or menstruation. The basal layer is always retained, and regeneration begins. At the end of the bleeding, the new endometrium is again prepared, and if no fertilization takes place, that one is also shed. Menarche. Menarche refers to the first menstruation on the onset of menstruation and occurs on the average woman. It occurs about 13 to 14 years, but it ranges about 9 to 17 years. Menarche marks the beginning of the reproductive life and is one of the manifestations of puberty. Menopause. Another name for menopause is climacteric. Outline for menopause. Definition, signs and symptoms, and deviation. What is menopause? It is gradual cessation of menstruation, and it marks the end of reproductive life. That is, it is the ending of one's menstruation. It occurs from 45 to 55 years but it can be as early as about 35 years and as late as about 60 years. During the menopause, the ovarian hormones are gradually withdrawn and other complex changes occur in the body. At the beginning of the menopause, the bleeding is scanty and the cycle becomes irregular for some months, and pregnancy can occur after months of amenorrhea. Signs and symptoms of the menopause. The woman experiences hot flashes and feel hot periodically. The heat is located at specific areas. She sweats heavily and the heat is pronounced in the afternoon. The blood pressure becomes raised during this time. There may be obesity. There are emotional changes. There are also insomnia, irritability, headaches, arthritis, waist pain, and others. Explain the condition to the patient if someone attends to you with this problem. But if the symptoms are beyond control, if you think that you cannot control the symptoms the person has expressed, it's better you refer her to see doctor. Deviations in menstruation. What are some of the abnormalities or deviations of menstruation? Dysmenorrhea, which means painful menstruation. Epimenorrhea, menstruation occurring at abnormal short intervals. The bleeding may occur more than usual, and the cycle may be about 20 days or less. Menorrhagia, excessive bleeding during menstruation. The cycle may be normal. Oligomenorrhea, scanty bleeding during menstruation. Metrorrhagia, it is complete irregularity of the menstrual cycle. Hypermenorrhea, menstruation which occurs more than 28 days. Unovular menstruation, this is when bleeding occurs in the absence of ovulation. What have you learned? What is menstrual cycle? List the phases of menstrual cycle. Explain the phases of menstrual cycle. Describe the menarche. Thank you.